All right,
All
we're
right, there
on.
we go.
We're on. Thanks everyone for joining. I wanted to get us together, particularly as we scale more. Really, just to do a weekly check-in. What's working? What do we need to handle that needs escalation? And more importantly, what could go wrong that we need to get onto sooner rather than later? I know that as the team's been quite small, a lot of you have had individual one-on-one conversations. Hopefully, this helps bring everything out in the open, and yeah, helps us as we scale. So what have we got? Look at the agenda document. There's a thing around priority and severity labels. So we've had some discussion around that. James, do you want to talk about that one and what we need to do as the next steps?
Yeah, I think so. Well, there are a few options there, but I don't think we reach any consensus yet. So I think we may want to just. Let me see. Yeah, maybe Luca, you want to check my last response. So I think Luca suggested creating some new labels, but I thought we could reuse the current ones basically. So yeah, I don't know if more. Sorry. Go on, Luca.
I did read it. I've just been out for the last few days, so I haven't had a chance to respond to it yet. So I think it might help, maybe for other folks like Jackie, possibly Bartek as well, to get some clarity on the way that engineering use P1, P2, P3 labels, because the way that the descriptions are, it's as if they're bug labels. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, where possibly the way that I read it is the way that I've started to label our issues. So if something isn't as urgent, like I will just label it as a P2 or a P3. But if something needs fixing, like or needs shipping ASAP, I add a P1 label. But it seems like that's not the correct way of doing it. So you also mentioned there's like that we can use the severity labels as well, which I did for a little bit. But again, like it seemed more like a bug focused workflow rather than like features and kind of shipping larger things like that. So I don't know if you want to provide, if you or Dennis could provide some more clarity on the way that folks are using labels, that would be helpful.
Dennis, this could be a good one for you. What are the other teams that you're looking at using? What's worked for you?
Yeah, so I mean, we use priority and severity for deliverables and bugs. So like priority determines whether like what trying not to use the word to define the word. Priority determines like what we need to rank in terms to apply the severity to. So what I mean by is like we might have 3 P1s, but we're trying to figure out which of these P1s are actually the most important. So it's almost like a sub priority, if that makes sense. So the severity does come in handy in terms of like saying in severity 1, like this is what we're committed to at least for delivering in the slated milestone. So
do you
and then everything else
use
Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say, so do you use the does the priority and severity labels change, like depending on what, like is it just constrained within that release as to what the priority labels are, or that might be where
in my experience it can change. It's not it can change. So like the same way priorities can change, right? So maybe we thought this was like the thing that has to get into 12.1, and then we find out like the customer doesn't need it or it's not as useful as we thought. When we rethink it, then we can change it. But it can also be reassessed for, I would imagine, for any other reason. So yeah, but to answer your question, yes.
Well, no, my question was more around, do you predominantly use the labels for the current release? Like, do they apply for like future releases? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, does it make sense just to kind of approach them in that single release, and then like, because the way that I think some of the reasons this conversation has come up is because as things are falling into like the next release, like because a lot of stuff has slipped from 12.1 to 12.2, but the stuff that's slipping is P1. So the stuff in 12.2, then we also have P1 stuff in 12.2. So then we have like a ton of P1 and S1 stuff in P2. So that's kind of where I'm kind of confused on how we should be using them. Does that make sense?
It might simply be that we're using the priority and severity labels correctly, but we just literally have a whole number of P1s that absolutely must get shipped.
Right.
So
That's kind of my comment, yeah, in the issue. Like this is the stuff that we need to get done at this priority and severity.
right. So hopefully that gets reassessed when we go into 12.2, and that's actually something I think we need to do both in manage and fulfillment. Is like taking into account. I mean, I think a lot of this has to do of the timing of when we do planning in relation to when the milestones start and begin or start and end. But like taking into account what's going to be carrying over 12.1, and then putting it next to 12.2, and then prioritizing everything as like the new 12.2. Because if we have an S1 from 12.1, for example, and it's not going to make it, I would imagine it's still the same severity carrying over. So then 12.2 has to be shaped around that, right? So that's something we're not doing right in manage, and something I'm hoping I just hopped off from a meeting with Measure from Manage, and that's what we just decided, like we need to come back later and reassess everything, because everyone's working on 12.1 stuff. No one knows when it's going to be done yet, and that just gives us zero certainty for 12.2. And I think we just need to take one milestone to kind of like get everything organized so that we're setting ourselves up for success, instead of committing to things that we have no idea or have zero information.
So is the decision?
It kind of sounds.
Sorry, Luke.
It kind of sounds like there may be a larger problem in that it's. So the expectation on product managers is that we need to have like a detailed 3-month plan, right? With obviously our vision in the future. But it seems like if we're saying it's happening in manage as well as fulfillment, I don't know if it's happening in other stages, but it seems like it's actually very hard to make a 3-month plan if something needs to be very specifically reshaped by the time the next release. I can't talk this morning. I don't have any coffee. I'm sorry. By the time the next release comes around, it seems like everything has to be readjusted and reshaped, which to me that should be something you're doing like maybe 5-6 months, not like the next release, right? We should be able to kind of know what we're going to be able to achieve in the next like 2 or 3 months, and it just seems like we're unable to do that at the moment. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's down to me. Maybe I'm just new at this, so I'm not planning things in quite the right way. But it might just be that because we're a new team, or maybe we don't have enough people. Like there could be many reasons as to why this happened.
I think one key reason is we don't have an established velocity, and I think we're working our way through estimation. So it's difficult with those two caveats to know where we'll end up in the future. I suspect that will get better as we as a group go through each milestone, go through each release.
Yeah, so I mean, I can just speak from, well, of course, it's from my experience. So for fulfillment, for example, is have gone through. So obviously, Vitaly just started 2 weeks ago, and Amar just started today. So it's like, it's going to be a little bit awkward, and I haven't done a good job myself of like estimating the issues. Though ideally, I prefer the person who's actually going to be assigned to it be the one estimating it. And that's kind of happening while we're working on stuff in the milestones. So ideally, you should be assessing this stuff before you even work on it, right? Of course, we want to find that balance so we're not having too much overhead with planning and estimation, but at the same time, we also have to ship stuff. So
yeah, this is a conversation that I've had with Tim as well, because Tim and I are sort of trying to iron out how we plan work, because he helps me a little bit with that, because obviously there's a lot of preliminary product design work that needs to be done with quite a lot of stuff in fulfillment. So but I had a conversation with him just before I went on holiday about how we need to basically, with regards to product design and any kind of UX work, we need to be like one step ahead of the engineers. So like all of that stuff has to be done a month before, so that it's ready to go. And that's basically what we've been doing, but it's mostly been happening for larger product discovery issues, less so for some that just require UX. And some of the conversations we've been having around UX is I've been trying to make sure and encourage engineers to involve Tim as much as they can. Just if anything is going to impact user experience, then someone from product design should be having at least a look at it and reviewing it. And that historically wasn't happening. I think mostly because, Ruben's very used to kind of doing things by himself, because he's had to do things all on his own for quite a long time. And it's also some issues, I think, can seem very simple, like, oh yeah, this doesn't really need like UX attention. But then when I've actually sat there and had a conversation with Tim about it, it turns out to be a little bit more complicated than perhaps we thought in terms of user impact. So those conversations I've been having with Tim have been really helpful, and it does help us understand how much bigger the issue is than it might look in the first instance. So yeah, like, but I do think with those smaller UX issues, like I'm trying to schedule them earlier with Tim, but that also means like scheduling them in like the 12.1 milestone. So to Tim, they might be a priority issue for him to work on. So maybe we need a way of like differentiating whether or not it's an engineering issue versus a UX issue. And do you usually use like things like the front end, back end, and UX labels to do that? Is that generally what they do? Okay, because I've been adding those I felt like it will require that input at some point.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, that's where we're starting to kind of corral. I mean, we're already doing those types of issues in Manage, but specifically for Measure, to summarize, like there's a big push for like getting analytics and value stream management out there and like getting stuff out there just because customers are super excited about them. That's great. But we're trying to do UX, backend, and front end all in the same milestone. And, I'm getting questions of, can front end, commit to this in 12.1? And it's like, I haven't even seen any UX specs. I don't know if backend is able to do all the filtering and provide all the data. And so what we really need to do, and it's, I don't know, I think people have a problem with it because it feels a little bit waterfall, but I think you can take an agile approach to it. But like, you kind of have to stage the work, because otherwise we're all kind of just committing to work with like 50% certainty or even less. And then, we're just kind of like, presenting stuff at the monthly kickoff saying like, here's what we're going to do. And then like, it doesn't hit the milestone. And I think that's been a chronic problem for a variety of reasons, whether it's security issues or, conflicting priorities and organization. But I think we're going to have to do some of that kind of discipline-based staging in order for us to be able to say, if we want to have this 3 to 6 month plan, and be like, yes, we can do this, because UX should have an adequate time to assess this. Backend has enough time for the data and everything else that has to happen, and then front end kind of has all the pieces together so they can at least say with high certainty like this can happen.
Yeah, cool. Makes sense.
So with regards to the specific issue around the labels, it sounds like a lot of our issues are simply because due to team maturity, we right now do have a lot of things that we need to sort. Luca, I do like your suggestion about using the Eisenhower labels as well. Is this something that we want to look at and commit to now, or do we want to wait and see how things pan out in the next releases planning?
Well, James actually made a good point that the P1 and the priority and severity labels essentially do that anyway. So we kind of have like an Eisenhower approach already in place. I think there's two problems. One, I think that just in general, the labels aren't described very well. Like they specifically say, where is it? SLA for bugs and security issues, right? Like it literally just specifies those. So that could be confusing for other people. Like other people may be having this conversation. So we could avoid that in the future if those are updated. But I think the larger issue is essentially what we've just been talking about, and it's just how we can how can we get better at scheduling and planning, like for the 2-3 releases ahead, based on our current situation of hiring and sort of grow together, I suppose.
Okay, so I think let's take a data approach to that. Let's get our numbers for where we are with velocity. Let's look at what weights we have and get better at predictability. I think that'll help us plan out issues, and then also separately try to gather the things that are derailing our sprints. So particularly people going directly to engineers, which I know James, you and Luca have done some work to try to stop that as well. And then seeing what we can do about pushing back on unplanned work. This last release had everything going for it. It had unplanned work coming in quite urgently. It had new hires coming in. It had people on leave. So I think we can just take the data and learn from that with regards to specific issues. So let's not make any changes then. Maybe if we feel the need to, I'll check to see if there's a handbook update that we can do to help clarify a few things. But I think for this particular issue, we can leave it for the moment and then reopen if it's an issue in the future.
Okay.
Maybe it's something we can bring up with Luca, maybe you can bring it up with some of your peers in product and see if they have the same challenge with the definitions of those labels.
Yeah,
Maybe there needs to be like a product definition.
Yeah, I'll check it out on the next call I have in a few minutes. I've got a team call I can ask there actually as a agenda item. I do think that there is another issue which is kind of around this, that it's not really around labels, but it is to do with kind of organizing issues. And we've sort of talked about this before last week when we had our last planning meeting, which was around weights and adding complexity to the issue, which, you know, like that's we only have one field to add a weight. Like, it might be that this is really easy for UX, whereas it's kind of a medium thing to do for backend, but it's really complex to do for front end. We don't know like how do you establish what the weight is for each individual group that's going to be working on this issue? Like, do we roll it up into one huge complexity weight, or do we somehow separate this out? Like, how do we tackle that problem? Because recently James has been doing a lot of the estimations.
Do we feel we want to try to split things by, like, split up the issues? I mean, to try to get that better granularity for weights, or does that seem like too much work?
I think a little bit. I think it's as soon as you start splitting things up into issues, I think it does make things a little bit more complicated, especially if you have something that's a really big epic already. I mean, it would I don't know if there's any guidelines around like how big an epic should be, but sometimes you see things come up that you didn't expect to see that generally relate to the completion of that epic. And we talked about this before, where should we focus on MRs rather than issues? I don't know. Can you add? You can't really add a weight to an MR, right? That's not a field, if I remember correctly.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Anyway, this could be a topic for next week, but it's just something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, we can add it up, and I think just in the same issue, front end plus back end. I think, especially with the old ones, I normally try to estimate both front end and back end. But I'm definitely not too great at estimating front end, of course.
My preference, as much as possible, is to split them into smaller issues. But if that's too much work, then rather than actually adding it up, I will take the largest weight. Because we have people working on things simultaneously anyway.
Can I add a point of clarity to the splitting things up into smaller issues? So the way that I see it from a product perspective is, what's the smallest iteration we can deliver for this? Yep. Like, what's the most acceptable thing? Rather than like, here is an issue that we need to deliver, let's split it into separate issues. That doesn't make it any smaller. That just organizes it into different works that have to be delivered. Like, turning it into a smaller issue, to me, sounds like we need to shrink down the MVC even more. I think there are two separate things, and I just wanted to add that point.
I think the disconnect is, from the issue perspective, you're looking at what customer value are we creating, but in terms of delivering that customer value, it might take 3 different teams to deliver. Right. Dennis, what were you going to say?
I was going to say the counterpoint, or an example I would try to provide for that counterpoint is, for example, if we need to add a dropdown or something to like a new parameter to the filter bar, the UX is already established, but to power that from the backend and front end side could be very difficult. And so it's hard to just, that's part of the problem, is if that's why I think we need some type of ability to track the weight per discipline is required, because UX may do anything, whereas may
I don't know if anyone else is
complexity.
him, but him.
Sorry, Dennis, we lost you for a bit there.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You need to add, for example, like a drop down or some parameter for filtering. The UX pattern is already established, for example, so the complexity could be 1 or 0, or like there may not be anything required at all. Mm-hmm. And then back end and front end may still have some difficulty getting that data there, or maybe there's a technical debt preventing us from adding a new filter to the filter bar, which is actually something we do have as a current problem. And where it's important to track those things separately.
I wonder if, like,
I don't know if you heard any of that, but maybe I can chime in.
I did the second time. I don't know if everyone else did. Thank you for repeating that. I wonder if we can step out of the constraints of what the GitLab fields offer us right now, and maybe we could test something with a template for something like this. Maybe we could think about like how, if we're trying to add complexities for each 3 area, like when I create like a larger issue that requires work from all 3 groups, maybe we could add something in that. I've started trying to add a little bit of a thing where I add like kind of tasks for people within it, so that like under the next steps, I don't know if anyone has, I know that James and Dennis, you might have seen that, but Jackie and Bartik might not. I try and add like a few steps, like basically tasks, what's next to do in there. And some of that is like, James, could you add a backend complexity to this? Like, Dennis, could you review, like, you know, those kinds of things. So I wonder if we could use templates or something just to test some things.
Let's also make sure that we cover this in our retrospectives. So for the issues that we had, where it would have made sense to make them more granular or otherwise, or find or where we felt that we didn't have the right approach, and learn from it that way.
Yeah, sounds good.
I've got an item in here around getting the team across 12.1. James, you're right. There's a 12.1 planning meeting, so let's push this and maybe discuss next week if we need to.
Yeah.
Luca, do you want to talk about Stripe? If we need to do that now, if you want to push it to next week.
I think it makes sense to push it to next week. We have a call with them tomorrow. I think all of you, I think except maybe Jackie, are up to date on where we're at with that. So if anyone has any glaring questions, I can answer it now. But other than that, I think we can wait till next week.
Good, I'll cover that async. James, the Unplanned label.
Yeah, just to mention that that issue has been closed now, so we now have the Unplanned label that we can use for those urgent requests, so we can start tracking those. Cool. And then my other point had to do with the daily stand-up thing, because I think because some people, if some people think that the updates are useful, then I think we should add it. And my suggestion there is about changing the second question, so not to add an extra question, because it might be a bit time-consuming as well, but to change the second one to something like, what are your plans for today, and if you have any blockers. So what do people think about this?
I'm curious about the amount of like what actual use people get out of doing that, because I noticed like 9 times out of 10 people say like, I'm good, I don't need any help. So
James, you and I discussed this previously, and you made a really good point that all the information definitely is there for someone to be able to go and see where we're up to. In saying that, the stand-ups that I'm finding from other teams, I just find really valuable to, when an engineer says, look, these are the 3 issues that I'm working on, and this is the progress, or this is where I'm stuck or finished. I find that personally really, really valuable. Looking at a Kanban board showing what is on an engineer's plate doesn't necessarily show me whether whether we're making the right progress, or whether the person's been doing something totally different. A big part of that is also me wanting to understand as much as possible about what the team does, and I do realize, and I do take your point, that it is a lot of extra information. So what does everyone else think?
I think so. From a product perspective, I actually find the having to type in these stand-up things very distracting, like having something bugging you all the time. So I tend to ignore it, because it just doesn't, I don't have anything that I can provide that's of value, and people kind of see what I'm doing most of the time anyway, like throughout issues and the channels and whatnot. I think from we need to think about like what problem are we trying to solve by having this stand-up thing that people are having to post every day. Like, if it's a huge distraction for people, then is it worth it? If other folks are finding it valuable in other teams, then what is it about that is specifically valuable? Like, do we want to, like, for me, it'd be really useful to know, like, hey, beginning of your day, like, what are you working on today? Like, just literally post an MR link, or like post an issue link or something, just so that I know what stuff an engineer is doing, so that because then you don't even have to necessarily provide an update on the MR or the issue if you're working on it. I just know that that's currently in progress. That's it. Because sometimes, like I went to an issue this morning, which was to do with telemetry, and there hadn't been an update on an MR that was the only open MR for an issue for 2 weeks. So I had no idea like what, and I had Scott ask me about it, that I now need to follow up with someone who's on holiday to find out what's going on, because it's for an e-group meeting. So just having, I've mentioned this before, and I mentioned it when I first joined the team, that having regular updates from engineers, just saying like, hey, this is what I'm doing, at least one update a week. Like if you're going to be out for 2 weeks, then say there's not going to be any progress on this for 2 weeks. And if it's a high priority issue or something like that, then maybe it needs to be handed off to somebody else so they can make sure it's shipped on time for the release. But anyway, sorry, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but as far as the stand-ups go, I think having those kind of regular updates as to what an engineer is working on every day would be really helpful. There's no expectation around it, like why are you doing this or whatever. It's just more like, this is helpful to know what you're doing.
Just throwing that, my other reason for it is just as team culture. As you get new team members in, it's one of the ways that they see what everyone else is on, how the team works as well. So that's probably my other reason. I was going to ask Dennis, but he's dropped off. We can push that for next week or discuss that asynchronously. I know that we're out of time. Any last minute thoughts for the last minute?
Good.
Let's update the agenda document with anything else, push what we can to next week, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for setting this up, Bartek.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.